Didn't call anyone. I just got in the truck and drove. It was 11:47 at night when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I remember the exact time because I'd been lying there staring at the ceiling for an hour already, the way I do most nights since my wife passed. The screen lit up the whole room. My daughter's name. I picked it up before the second ring. Dad. That was all she said. Just that one word. But I've been her father for 34 years. I know every version of that word. The one she used when she scraped her knee at 7. The one she used when she didn't make the volleyball team at 15. The one she used at her mother's funeral, standing beside me in the rain outside a church in Knoxville. This was a different one. One I'd never heard before. Dad, I need you to come. Please don't ask questions right now. Just come. She gave me an address. I wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt on the nightstand. Then the call went quiet. Not ended, just quiet. And I heard a man's voice in the background, low and cold, saying her name once like a warning. Then the line went dead. I didn't sit there thinking about it. I didn't call her back. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door, the same hook I've kept them on for 22 years, and I walked out into the November dark and got in my truck. My daughter had been married for 3 years. Her husband's name was Rowan. I'll say this plainly, I never trusted him. Not from the first dinner she brought him home to. He had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he laughed too loud at his own jokes. And whenever I said something he disagreed with, he'd wait until my daughter left the room before he let you see the real expression on his face. I'm 63 years old. I've known men like that my whole life. I spent 30 years as a high school principal in a mid-sized city in Tennessee, and you learn fast how to read people when your job is to sit across a desk from them and figure out whether they're telling you the truth. But my daughter loved him, and I raised her to make her own choices, so I kept my mouth shut and I watched. For the first year, things seemed fine. They bought a house in Chattanooga, 40 minutes from where I live. She was still calling me every Sunday. We still had our standing lunch on the second Saturday of every month at a diner she'd loved since she was a kid, the kind of place with red vinyl booze and coffee that comes in a white ceramic mug and never runs out. She still laughed easily. She still seemed like herself. Then small things started changing. She'd cancel our Saturday lunches. Once, twice, then so often that we stopped calling them standing plans and just called them whenever I can plans. She stopped talking about her job, which she'd always loved. She was a physical therapist, good at it, genuinely happy in it. She started wearing long sleeves in the summer. When I asked her about it once, she laughed and said she ran cold. She always had. That was true. I'd known her for 34 years. But something in the way she said it, I noticed. I didn't push. I told myself I was being a paranoid old man who couldn't let his daughter live her life. I told myself 100 versions of that story over 2 years, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to look at directly. The address she gave me was not her house. I realized that about 10 miles in, when I pulled up the route on my phone and saw the destination was on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood I knew to be his mother's neighborhood. Rowan's mother. I'd met her 3 times. Her name was Margaret, and she was the kind of woman who speaks about other people's children like they're visiting pets. Pleasant enough to look at, not quite real, not quite belonging to themselves. At my daughter's wedding, she had pulled me aside before the reception and told me, with a hand on my arm and a warm smile, that she hoped my daughter knew how lucky she was. I had smiled back and said nothing, but I remembered it. I pulled onto Margaret Street at 12:31 in the morning. The house was lit up. Living room, upstairs windows, a light above the garage. I parked at the curb. Sat there for maybe 30 seconds. Then I got out. I rang the doorbell. I could hear movement inside. Then silence. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, and the porch light came on, and the door opened. But only as far as the chain lock allowed. Margaret looked at me through that gap. She was in a housecoat, her gray hair pinned back, her expression the particular kind of calm that people practice ahead of time. "It's almost 1 in the morning," she said. "I know what time it is. My daughter called me. I need to see her. She's sleeping." I looked at her steadily. "She called me 45 minutes ago. She asked me to come." She was upset. She's settled down now. You don't need to be here." I heard something then, from somewhere behind her, upstairs maybe. A sound I couldn't fully identify, a door closing or a chair scraping the floor, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Margaret," I said, and I kept my voice as level as I could. "I'm asking you one more time to let me in to see my daughter." She looked at me with that practiced calm. "She's my daughter-in-law," she said. "She's in my home, and I don't think your coming in here in the middle of the night is going to help anyone." Then she closed the door. I stood on that porch for maybe 10 seconds. Then I took out my phone and called 911. I know what the comment sections on these videos say, that the father should have called the police first before he drove. And maybe that's right. But here is what was in my head in those 10 seconds. I had been to the police before. 8 months earlier, I'd sat in a waiting room at a precinct on a Tuesday afternoon and told an officer everything I was worried about, every small thing I'd noticed adding up, and the officer had listened patiently and then explained, also patiently, that without physical evidence or a report from my daughter herself, there was very little they could do. She was an adult. She had not filed any report. I had gone home and sat in my driveway for a long time before I went inside. So I understood the limits of a phone call, but I also understood that I was a 63-year-old man standing alone on a porch at midnight, and that what I needed was a record, a timestamp, a witness who wasn't me. The dispatcher answered. I told her I had received a distress call from my daughter, that I was at the address, that the occupants were refusing to allow me to see her, and that I had reason to believe she might be in danger. The dispatcher's voice was steady and professional. She told me to stay where I was. She told me units were on the way. I stayed where I was. I sat down on the top porch step, and I looked at my hands in the dark, and I tried to breathe normally. The November cold was settling in. I hadn't grabbed a jacket when I left the house. 2 officers arrived in under 10 minutes, a man and a woman. I stood up and met them at the bottom of the steps and told them everything calmly. The call, the time, the words my daughter had used, what I'd heard through the door. They listened. Then the female officer knocked. Margaret answered the door fully this time. She was composed. She looked at the officers with an expression of concerned confusion, like she was as baffled as anyone about what was happening. She said her daughter-in-law had arrived earlier that evening, very distressed after an argument with her husband, that she had given her some tea and a place to sleep, and that some well-meaning but alarmist members of the family had apparently gotten the wrong idea. She said it so smoothly. I'll give her that. The officers asked if they could check on my daughter. Margaret smiled graciously and led them inside. I was asked to wait on the porch. I waited 4 minutes. Then the female officer came back out and looked at me and said, "Sir, your daughter is asking to speak with you." She was sitting in a small bedroom at the top of the stairs, in an armchair in the corner, and when I walked in, I stopped in a doorway because I needed a moment before she saw my face. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone. She was holding a mug with both hands, even though it had clearly been empty for a while. Just holding it like it was something to hold on to. She looked up at me and she said, "Dad," in that voice again. The one I'd heard on the phone, the one I'd never heard before in 34 years. I crossed the room and I sat on the edge of the bed across from her, and I didn't say anything. I let her talk. She talked for a long time. It had not started with a bruise. It never starts with a bruise. It had started with small things, decisions made without her. Money moved without her knowledge. Friends quietly discouraged. Her voice in conversations gently talked over until she stopped bothering to speak up. She described the process the way people describe being slowly put to sleep. You don't notice the exact moment it happens. You just become smaller, and then one day you look in the mirror and you don't quite recognize the person looking back at you. The physical part had started 7 months ago, after I'd sat in that police waiting room. The timing wasn't coincidental. Rowan had found out about my visit. She didn't know how, but he found out, and the argument that followed was the first time she'd been afraid of him in a way she couldn't explain away. Tonight, he had come home late and found something. A text thread on her phone. messages to a college friend she reconnected with, and it had escalated. She'd ended up at his mother's house because it was closer than home, because she couldn't think straight, because she had called me from the bathroom while Margaret was downstairs making tea, and Rowan was still somewhere in the house. The officers took her statement. They photographed the bruise. They called for a third unit and went back to the house my daughter shared with her husband. Rowan was arrested that night. I drove my daughter to my house in the dark, and she fell asleep in the passenger seat about 20 minutes out. The way she used to fall asleep in the car as a little girl on long drives home from her grandmother's house in Georgia. I kept both hands on the wheel and I watched the road, and I didn't let myself think about anything except getting her there safely. She slept in the guest room, which had been her room before she moved out at 22. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after. With a cup of coffee I didn't drink. In the morning, she called her job. Then she called a lawyer, a family law attorney in Chattanooga that a coworker had recommended. A woman with 20 years of experience in exactly these situations. I sat at the kitchen table while my daughter made those calls, and I did not offer my opinion unless she asked for it. That was the most useful thing I could do. When your child has spent 3 years having her voice slowly removed from her own life, the last thing she needs is her father taking it the rest of the way. The divorce process was not fast, and it was not simple. Rowan had his mother's money behind him, and an attorney who seemed personally invested in making everything as difficult as possible. There was a period of about 6 weeks in January where things were genuinely uncertain, where I lay awake more nights than not, where I made more coffee than I drank. But my daughter had documentation. She had the police report from November. She had the photographs. She had a record of the 911 call and the timestamp of her call to me. She had her own statement and the statement of the officers who had responded that night. Her attorney was good, patient and thorough and relentless in the specific, quiet way that good attorneys are. Rowan did not get what he wanted. I won't go into the full legal detail because some of it is still my daughter's private business to share or not share as she chooses, but I will say that by March, she was back in her own place. A small apartment she found herself, on the second floor of a building with good natural light and a balcony she put a bird feeder on. I helped her move in on a Saturday. We carried boxes, re-put furniture together badly and had to redo it. We ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor because the couch wasn't where it was supposed to be yet. She laughed that day. Genuinely. Not the careful version I'd been hearing for 2 years. The old one, Margaret, I have not spoken to since the night on the porch. I have no desire to. There is a version of this story where she was also a victim of her son's patterns, where she simply did not know how to be anything other than loyal to him. Maybe that's true, but she looked at me through that chain lock at midnight and told me my daughter was sleeping and she knew what she was doing. I can hold both things at once. Compassion for whatever shaped her, and a clear-eyed understanding of the choice she made that night. Rowan, I do not think about much. Men like that have a way of shrinking back to their actual size once the conditions they depend on disappear. He was large in my daughter's life because she was isolated and he controlled the room. Without that, he's just a man with a record and a mother who made his calls for him. I don't need to think about him to be finished with him. What I think about instead is this. I think about the 2 years when I noticed things and told myself I was being paranoid. I run that period back sometimes, like a film you've seen enough times that you can identify every moment where the plot could have gone differently. I could have pressed harder. I could have found a different way to say what I was seeing. I could have kept our Saturday lunches going by sheer force of will, kept that line of contact open, made it harder for the distance to set in. I don't know if it would have changed anything. These situations have their own gravity, but I know that the next time I notice something, I will not spend 2 years arguing myself out of it. My daughter and I have our Saturday lunches again. Same diner, red vinyl booths, coffee in white ceramic mugs. She talks about her job. She's taken on a few new patients, expanded her hours, been asked to help train 2 newer therapists. She started running again, something she loved in college and had somehow stopped doing. She looks like herself. More like herself, maybe, than she did even before. Last month she asked me, over eggs and toast on a gray February morning, whether I'd been scared that night. Driving over in the dark, not knowing what I was going to find, I thought about it honestly before I answered. I wanted to give her a true answer, not a reassuring one. Yes, I said, but it was the kind of scared where you don't stop, where the fear just becomes part of the fuel. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, like that made sense to her. I think it did. I think she knows that version of scared now too. We finished our coffee and left a good tip and walked out into the February cold, and she looped her arm through mine the way she used to when she was small, and we walked to the parking lot and said goodbye the way we always do. And I drove home with the windows cracked because I liked the cold air. And I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a minute before going inside. The house was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than it used to be. It was the kind you can breathe in.